Imagine carrying a secret so dark, so heavy, that most people would crack under the weight of it within days. Now imagine carrying that same secret for 34 years. Waking up every single morning with it. Eating dinner with it. Going to bed with it. Watching the news, seeing the investigators, knowing they are looking for you, and smiling. Because you know they will never find you. You know it because you are too careful. Too smart. Too invisible. You have already gotten away with it. That is exactly what one man believed for over 3 decades. He had murdered a young mother in the dead of night, vanished without a trace, and rebuilt his life as though nothing had ever happened. And for a long, long time, the world let him. The police had nothing. The family had nothing. The case went cold, and the years kept moving, and the man kept living, and justice stayed silent. But here is what this man did not understand. He did not understand that buried deep inside him was something far more dangerous than his crime. Something that would one day reach out of the darkness and betray him in a way no detective ever could. His own arrogance. And one quiet day, that arrogance picked up a pen, wrote a letter, licked an envelope, and sealed his fate without ever knowing it. Welcome to Cold Case Vault. Tonight, we open the file on Anna Jean Kane. A young mother. A daughter. A sister. A woman whose life was stolen on a cold October night in rural Pennsylvania, and whose killer spent 34 years believing he had beaten the system. He was wrong. And the story of how he was finally exposed is one of the most extraordinary tales of justice, science, and sheer human ego you will ever hear. Stay with us. Because this one will shake you. If you're already locked in, drop a comment right now and let us know where you're watching from. And if Cold Case Vault is new to you, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Every case we cover is a promise that no matter how much time passes, the truth has a way of coming out. Now let's get into it. It began on the 23rd of October, 1988. Perry Township, Pennsylvania. A quiet, rural community tucked into the rolling landscape of Berks County, the kind of place where people leave their doors unlocked, where everybody knows their neighbor's name, and where the biggest news on any given week is the weather or the harvest. A place where nothing bad is supposed to happen. That morning, a passerby was moving along a lonely stretch of road called Onlani Trail Road when they saw something that made them stop cold. Lying at the roadside was the body of a young woman. The scene was brutal. Disrespectful in its violence. The kind of image that etches itself permanently into the memory of anyone who witnesses it. For the first officers who arrived and stood over that body in the pale autumn light, this was not just a crime scene. It was a wound cut into the heart of their community. For the people of Perry Township, this was the morning that changed everything, the moment that made you lock your doors, check your mirrors, and wonder about the person standing behind you in line. The victim was identified as 26-year-old Anna Jean Kane. In those early days, the headlines often reduced Anna to her circumstances. She was a young mother of 3, 2 sons and a daughter, who had been fighting serious financial hardship. She had been working as a prostitute in the nearby city of Reading, and tragically, that reality would cloud the first phase of the investigation. There were people in the community who whispered that her lifestyle had made her a target. That somehow, the choices she had made explained what happened to her. The Pennsylvania State Police refused to accept that logic. A murder is a murder. A victim is a victim. And Anna Jean Kane deserved every ounce of justice the law could provide. Because to her family, Anna was never a statistic. She was never a headline. She was a mother, the kind of mother whose children ran to her when they were scared, whose laugh lit up a room, whose voice was the last thing her kids wanted to hear before they fell asleep. When she was taken from them, 3 small children were left behind to grow up in the shadow of a question that had no answer. Who did this? And why have they never paid for it? The forensic pathologist, Dr. Neil Hoffman, delivered the grim findings of the autopsy. Anna had been savagely beaten before her death, but the official cause of death was strangulation. The killer had used a length of baling twine, thick, coarse cord of the kind used on farms to bind hay bales, the kind that requires strong hands and deliberate force. It had been wrapped around her neck and pulled so tightly that it left deep, unmistakable marks carved into her skin. That detail meant something. It pointed to a killer with physical strength and familiarity with rural tools and manual labor. This was not a weapon someone had brought from a hardware store. This was something they grabbed from their surroundings. Someone who knew that world. Anna had last been seen alive just after 1 o'clock in the morning, near the corner of Franklin and South 6th Streets in Reading. Her body was found roughly 12 hours later. That 12-hour window, that stretch of darkness between midnight and dawn, was all the time the killer needed to disappear completely. And disappear he did. The first 48 hours of a murder investigation are everything. They are the window during which trails are still warm, witnesses still remember, and physical evidence still exists in its purest form. Every hour that passes without a break is an hour the killer uses to cover his tracks, build his alibi, and put distance between himself and what he has done. For the detectives working Anna Kane's case, those hours slipped away without a single solid lead. The nature of Anna's life and work meant the potential suspect pool was enormous and nearly impossible to navigate. She had moved through a world of transient encounters and high-risk situations. The police had a victim, a cause of death, and a crime scene, but they had no witnesses to the killing itself. The man who did this had struck in the dead of night and then vanished as completely as a ghost. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. The trail went cold. But in the forensics laboratory, the investigation refused to die. The scientists working Anna's case had one remaining thread to pull. The clothing she had been wearing. Back in 1988, DNA technology was in its earliest infancy. It bore almost no resemblance to the precision instrument it would later become. But the investigators collecting evidence at that scene made a decision that, in retrospect, was one of the most consequential decisions in the entire history of this case. They carefully collected Anna's clothing, bagged each item individually, logged every piece, and stored it all in a climate-controlled evidence room. They had no way of knowing what they were really doing. They could not have imagined that those sealed bags would one day hold the key to a mystery that would take more than 3 decades to unravel. From the fabric of that clothing, forensic analysts managed to extract something invisible to the naked eye. A trace amount of DNA from an unknown male. A genetic fingerprint. A direct, biological thread connecting an unnamed man to Anna Kane's final moments alive. For the detectives who had been staring at a wall of nothing, this was the first crack of light. They had a profile. They had a ghost's genetic shadow. But a shadow is not a name. When the FBI launched its national DNA database of convicted offenders in the 1990s, investigators immediately ran the unknown profile through the system. They held their breath. They waited. Nothing. No match. Not a single hit. And that result told them something chilling. Their suspect had never been arrested or convicted of a serious enough crime to have his DNA collected. He was not in the system. He had slipped through every net the justice system had ever cast. He was living completely off the grid of the very mechanisms designed to catch men like him. He was not just a ghost. He was a perfect ghost. As the years continued to pass, the file on Anna Jean Kane's murder slowly disappeared beneath newer cases and newer crises. Detectives who had worked it retired. Young officers who joined the force had no memory of the case at all. Every now and then, someone would pull the file back out, stare at the DNA profile, and feel that crushing, hollow frustration of being so close to something you can never quite reach. For Anna's children, those years were a particular kind of torment. They grew up carrying a wound that never fully closed, their grief suspended in time, frozen on that October morning while the rest of the world kept moving. They could not fully mourn because there was no resolution. No justice. No name to attach to the face they imagined in their darkest moments. Their mother's killer was out there somewhere, living a normal life, and there was nothing they could do about it. The case looked, for all the world, like a perfect crime. Then, in February of 1990, roughly a year and a half after Anna's murder, the local newspaper, the Reading Eagle, ran a front-page story revisiting the case. It was a public appeal. A call for anyone with information to come forward. The kind of story newspapers run when investigators have run out of other options. And then something happened that nobody could have predicted. A letter arrived at the newspaper's offices. The writer introduced himself as a concerned citizen. Someone who had seen the article and simply wanted to help. The tone was measured and careful, at least on the surface. But as the staff read further, and then as the police read it, a cold and terrible understanding began to take shape. This was not a tip from a neighbor who had seen something suspicious. This was not a good Samaritan reaching out with second-hand information. This letter was something else entirely. It was soaked in intimate, disturbing knowledge about the murder. Specific details that had never been released to the public. Facts that had been deliberately withheld from the press specifically so that investigators could use them to evaluate the credibility of anyone who came forward. The writer knew things that only a handful of detectives and one other person in the entire world could possibly know. The killer himself. He described the position of the body. The type of cord used. The precise condition of Anna's clothing. And he described it with a familiarity that made the detective's skin crawl. But perhaps what was most disturbing of all was not what he knew. It was the tone in which he shared it. There was no guilt in that letter. No remorse. No weight of conscience finally becoming too heavy to carry. This was not the confession of a man cracking under the pressure of what he had done. It was a boast. He had seen the newspaper article and his ego, that enormous, reckless, uncontrollable ego, could not resist reaching out. He was taunting the police. Flaunting his freedom. Rubbing their noses in the fact that he was still walking around while they had nothing. He needed them to know that he was smarter than them. That he had won. That the perfect crime was still perfect. Psychologists who later reviewed the letter described the behavior as textbook narcissistic offender psychology, the compulsive need for recognition even for the worst things you have ever done. The inability to stay hidden when the spotlight comes near. The dangerous, irresistible hunger to be seen. For investigators, the experience of reading that letter was something they would never forget. Sickening and electrifying at the same time. They were holding the words of the man they had been hunting. He had walked out of the shadows, not with his face, but with his voice, and handed them something extraordinary. And then he handed them something even better. In his arrogance, he had licked the envelope shut. That single act, the act of moistening an envelope flap with his tongue before pressing it closed, became the most consequential moment of his life. Investigators carefully swabbed the seal of that envelope and sent it off for DNA analysis. The question was simple: did the DNA on this envelope match the DNA recovered from Anna Kane's clothing? The answer came back. A perfect match. The man who wrote that letter was, beyond any scientific doubt, the same man who had murdered Anna Jean Kane. They had his words. They had his DNA. They had his psychological fingerprint. A man so intoxicated by his own cleverness that he had mailed a piece of evidence straight into the hands of the people looking for him. But they still did not have his name. They ran the profile through the national database again. And again. And again. Nothing. The ghost had stepped briefly into the light, only to dissolve back into the darkness, leaving behind more evidence than ever before, but still no identity. The taunting letter went into a sealed evidence box. And the killer went on with his life. If you're still watching at this point, drop a comment with the words, "I'm still here." Let's see who's truly following this story, because what happens next is the part that will keep you up at night. The years that followed were the hardest kind of silence. The case file sat in the cold case unit, now containing both a damning DNA profile and a taunting letter written by the killer's own hand, and waited. Detectives who worked it would occasionally pull it out, read the letter again, and feel the frustration fresh as the day it arrived. Some of them passed the file to younger colleagues when they retired, with one quiet instruction: don't give up on this one. Outside the police station, Anna's 3 children were growing up. Every birthday without her. Every holiday. Every graduation, every milestone, every ordinary Tuesday that a mother is supposed to be present for, she was not there. Her absence was a permanent presence in their lives. And hovering over every single moment was the knowledge that the man who had done this was free. Living somewhere. Perhaps nearby. Perhaps even someone they had passed on the street without knowing it. They had to mourn their mother's death and the brutal way she died and the injustice of her killer going unpunished, all at the same time. That is a grief that has no bottom. Anna's family held tightly to who she had actually been. Not the person the headlines described, but the woman they had loved. A warm, caring mother. A young woman with a laugh that her children would spend the rest of their lives trying to fully recall. They planted flowers for her. They told stories about her. They protected her grandchildren, children she never got to meet, from the weight of the unknown. Elsewhere, the man who had killed her was growing older. He was working, living, perhaps even building relationships of his own. With each passing year, he must have felt the danger receding further and further into the distance. After 10 years, perhaps he thought about it less. After 20 years, perhaps he had almost convinced himself it had not really happened. After 30, perhaps he believed, truly and completely, that he was safe. That the secret would die with him. That he had won. In a climate-controlled evidence room, undisturbed, a sealed bag of clothing and an envelope with dried saliva waited for the world to catch up. Then came the year 2022. And with it, a technology that was quietly rewriting the entire landscape of cold case investigation. Investigative genetic genealogy. A science so powerful, so precise, and so unexpected that it was giving names to killers who had been ghosts for decades. And it works in a way that is almost poetic in its elegance. For decades, forensic DNA had operated like a locked door. If investigators had the key, meaning, if the suspect's DNA was already in a criminal database, they could open it. If the suspect had never been arrested and processed, the door stayed shut. Forever. Genetic genealogy does not try the door. It finds an open window. Instead of searching directly for the killer's DNA, it searches for the DNA of his relatives. People who have voluntarily uploaded their genetic profiles to public genealogy websites, platforms like Ancestry DNA and 23andMe, in order to explore their family histories. These are ordinary people, curious about their heritage, who have no idea that somewhere in their family tree there is a man who killed someone. And by sharing their DNA publicly, they have unknowingly created a pathway back to him. The technology can identify matches as distant as second cousins, third cousins, even fourth cousins. Anyone who shares a meaningful fragment of DNA with the suspect. From there, professional genealogists construct a family tree in reverse, starting with those distant relatives, tracing backward through generations to find the common ancestor they share with the killer, and then building the tree forward again, branch by branch, generation by generation, narrowing and narrowing until the pool of possible suspects shrinks to something manageable. It is painstaking, meticulous, extraordinary work. But it works. In 2022, the Pennsylvania State Police accessed a new grant designated for cold case investigations and decided to apply this approach to Anna Kane's case. They partnered with Parabon Nanolabs, a Virginia-based company operating at the absolute cutting edge of forensic genetic science. Parabon's team took the killer's DNA profile, the same one that had been sitting untouched in a database for over 30 years, and uploaded it to the public genealogy sites. For the first time since 1988, investigators were not looking for a criminal record. They were looking for a family. And for the first time in 34 years, something came back. Not a hit on the killer himself. A hit on his relatives. The ghost had family. And his family had shared their DNA with the world. The team began the painstaking work of constructing a massive family tree in reverse. Starting from those distant cousins, they traced backward through census records, obituaries, birth certificates, old newspaper archives, and public records, moving generation by generation until they identified a set of shared ancestors. Then they turned the tree around and began building it forward, following every branch, every descendant, every possibility. They focused in on one particular family line. A family with deep, established roots in Berks County, Pennsylvania. The same county where Anna Kane had been murdered 34 years earlier. The net was tightening. After weeks of painstaking research, the vast family tree finally narrowed to a single point. A single name. A name that had never appeared in the case file. Never been mentioned by a witness. Never raised a single suspicion in over 3 decades. Scott Grimm. When investigators began building a profile of Scott Grimm, the details fell into place with a precision that was almost eerie. In October of 1988, at the time of Anna's murder, Scott Grimm was 26 years old, the exact same age as his victim. He was from the Hamburg area and had been living in and around Reading at the time. The same geography. The same world as Anna. Close enough that their paths could have crossed a dozen times without anyone thinking twice about it. And yet his name had never come up. Not once in 34 years. No witness had pointed at him. No informant had whispered his name. No investigative thread had ever led in his direction. Neighbors would later describe him as quiet, perhaps a little odd, but nothing that would raise any alarm. He worked regular jobs. He paid his taxes. He kept to himself. The perfect camouflage. But then investigators discovered something that stopped them cold. Scott Grimm had died in 2018. 4 years before the genealogy investigation had identified him. He had passed away from natural causes at the age of 58. The ghost they had been hunting for over 3 decades was already dead. There would be no arrest. No courtroom. No moment where Anna's grown children could sit in the gallery and watch him stand before a judge and answer for what he had done. For the detectives who had carried this case for years, the feeling was something almost impossible to describe, relief and fury and grief all tangled together. They had the name. They finally had the name. But justice in its fullest form would never be delivered. Still, they needed to be certain. A genealogy result, however strong, is a lead, not a conclusion. To officially close the case, they needed a direct DNA comparison to Scott Grimm himself. They obtained a sample of his DNA for testing. And then, as they dug into his past, they found one final piece of evidence. The piece that sealed everything completely. The piece that transformed a strong lead into an unbreakable chain. It turned out that sending menacing letters was not a one-time act of impulse for Scott Grimm. It was a habit. In 2002, 12 years after he had sent that taunting letter to the Reading Eagle, Grimm had been arrested for harassing a former business partner. His chosen method of harassment? Mailing threatening letters. The investigators who handled that case had preserved all of the evidence, including the envelopes. The envelopes that Scott Grimm had licked shut with his own tongue. That case file had been sitting in a completely different drawer, in a completely different evidence room, for 20 years. Untouched. Unconnected to the Anna Kane investigation. Until now. The Pennsylvania State Police Laboratory assembled 4 sources of DNA for comparison. First, the DNA recovered from Anna Kane's clothing in 1988. Second, the saliva from the taunting letter sent to the Reading Eagle in 1990. Third, a direct sample of Scott Grimm's own DNA. And fourth, the saliva collected from the envelopes in the 2002 harassment case. The results came back. A perfect match across all 4 samples. Every single data point aligned. The DNA from the murder scene. The DNA from the bragging letter. The DNA from the harassment case. The DNA from Scott Grimm himself. One man. One chain of evidence. Unbreakable. Scott Grimm had murdered Anna Jean Kane. After 34 years, the ghost finally had a name. And the case was officially closed. When the news reached Anna's family in 2022, it arrived like a wave that had been building for 34 years. There was relief, genuine, overwhelming relief at finally having an answer. But there was also a fresh wave of grief, the kind that comes when something you have been waiting for finally arrives and you realize that the waiting had become a strange kind of protection. Now it was real. Now there was a face. A name. A man who had gone to work every day and come home every night and lived his life while their mother was in the ground. They had spent decades imagining who this person might be. Wondering if they had ever been in the same room as him. Wondering if he still thought about what he had done. To finally see a name and a face brought a peace that was complicated and incomplete but real. They held a private gathering. For the first time, they could say it out loud. We know who did this. He could never be confronted in a courtroom. He would never have to sit in a chair and hear his crimes described in front of the people who loved his victim. But he had lived with what he had done every single day until the day he died. That knowledge had followed him into every room, sat with him at every dinner table, been there in the darkness every night when he closed his eyes. His secret had not protected him. It had haunted him. And whatever peace he thought he had found in the years between the murder and his death was built on a foundation of someone else's suffering. One family member, speaking about the resolution, put it simply. The truth was always going to come out. It just took longer than we had hoped. And when asked what she would want to say to Scott Grimm if she could, knowing she never would, the answer was quiet and devastating. Why? Was it worth it? Are you sorry? Things you will never know. Berks County District Attorney John Adams acknowledged that while a trial was impossible, the identification of Scott Grimm brought genuine closure to a family who had endured far too long without answers. He reminded the public of something that deserves to be said out loud: no case is truly cold as long as the evidence is preserved. Those investigators in 1988, the ones who carefully bagged and tagged Anna's clothing without knowing why it would ever matter, they made a decision that saved the truth for a generation of scientists who had not yet been born. That single act of professional diligence is the reason Anna's children got answers. It is the reason this story has an ending. And the science that delivered that ending, investigative genetic genealogy, is a revolution in the truest sense of the word. It reaches backward through time in a way that no previous tool ever could. It finds the living relatives of the dead and the guilty and follows the invisible biological thread back to its source. It proves that no matter how carefully a person hides, their own DNA, their own family tree, their own biology can become the instrument of their undoing. Scott Grimm thought he had committed the perfect murder. He spent 34 years believing it. He constructed a life on top of that belief, built walls around it, watched the years pile up like insurance against ever being found. He underestimated a family that never stopped grieving. He underestimated detectives who passed a file down through generations with one instruction: do not give up. He underestimated a science he could not have imagined. And most of all, he underestimated his own ego, the part of him that could not stay quiet, that could not let a newspaper article pass without answering it, that reached into a drawer, pulled out a pen, wrote a letter, and licked an envelope. That one moment. That 1 second of arrogance. That is what ended him. It was not a witness. It was not a confession made in a moment of weakness. It was not a slip of the tongue or a careless footprint. It was the act of sealing an envelope with his own saliva and trusting that the science of 1990 could never catch up to him. He was wrong. And Anna Jean Kane, a young mother of 3 who deserved so much more than what she got, finally, after 34 long years, got the only thing her family could still give her. Her name, cleared of the unknown. Her story, finished. Her killer, identified. Justice delayed. But not denied. If this story moved you, hit the like button and leave a comment telling us what struck you most. Was it the letter, the science, or the family's 34 years of waiting? Subscribe to Cold Case Vault and ring that bell so you never miss another file we open. Every story on this channel is a reminder that time is on the side of the truth. Drop the name of a cold case you want us to cover next. We read every single comment. And to the family of Anna Jean Kane, this one was for you.